Well, folks, we do not have any resolution with the Save America Act tonight. President Trump, though, is telling Senator Thune that his recess is hostage. And there's been some action in the courts, but Trump's executive order remains blocked in 23 states and in D.C. But there's one thing that many people do not realize. President Trump has the power by virtue of the Constitution to call the Senate back from recess. Now, on July 25th, the First Circuit kept the injunctions in place. That means parts of Trump's election order remain blocked in 23 states and Washington, D.C., and that's through the 2026 midterms. The Trump administration is still litigating, and this was not a final ruling on every part of Trump's election integrity agenda, but it did keep the challenge provisions blocked in those jurisdictions, while the appeals continue. Well, this is what the Senate route means. An executive order directs the executive branch. The state can sue. A judge can issue an injunction, and the policy can spend months moving through appeals. Now, Congress can put the rule into federal law. But that law can still be challenged in court, but it no longer depends on one administration's direction to federal agencies. The live vehicle is Senate 1383, and it began as a Senate Veterans Bill. On February 11th, the House replaced the text with the Save America Act and passed that amendment 218 to 213. The amended bill reached the Senate's desk on February 12th. The House amendment requires documentation and proof of citizenship to register for federal elections and a photo ID to vote. The Senate now has to decide whether to agree to the House amendment, and Thune controls when that question gets floor time. That doesn't mean Thune can manufacture the 60 votes. It means he can call up the bill, force the procedure of votes, identify where the opposition is, and decide whether Republicans will challenge the precedent that lets a minority stop the legislation. And the Senate returned today at 3, and according to the calendar, they didn't really get anything done. And look, they go on recess August 10th. That gives Trump several options, and each one has a limit. Now, before the Senate leaves, Trump can keep the pressure on Senate Leader Thune and on individual Republican senators. He can demand a floor date, demand a count of Republican votes, and he can make the holdouts answer for themselves. He can also demand a cloture vote, even if Democrats are expected to block the bill. A failed cloture vote would not pass SAVE, but it would create a public record. Now, we would know whether the obstacle is the Democrats, Republican deflections, or leadership refusing to bring the fight to the floor. That's the first decision that Senator Thune has to make. Does he expose the votes, or does he protect the Senate from having to actually cast them? Now, if the Senate leaves, Trump has a constitutional response. Article 2, Section 3 gives the president authority on extraordinary occasions to convene both houses of Congress or either one of them. The Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel has concluded that this power reaches an intra-session break, which that is the exact kind of recess that we're talking about here. So Trump can call them back. Now, that doesn't pass the act itself. It also doesn't give Trump control of the Senate floor, but it would create an opportunity, but it still wouldn't create the votes needed to end the debate. That would require the senators to return and put the unresolved bill back in front of the country. Now, if you didn't know, Harry Truman used the same constitutional power in 1948 after Congress left with unfinished business. He called the Republican-controlled Congress back and forced its members to answer for what they would or would not do. And Trump could use the same power, same way. Reconvene the Senate, demand action on SAVE, and remove "we are in recess" as one of their excuses. Now, the administration also has a legal option. It can continue the First Circuit appeal, and after losing the stay request in the court, seek emergency relief from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rule 23 provides a path to request a stay. That route is not a guarantee and doesn't replace the Senate fight, but it would give Trump another track. So he could keep both tracks moving at once. He could defend the order, and he could demand a statute from Congress. Now, to the question that people will ask next, can President Trump replace Senate Majority Leader Thune? Because I've seen that a lot. The answer to that is no. The president doesn't appoint or fire the Senate Majority Leader. Senate Republicans elected Thune as their floor leader, and the office isn't created by the Constitution, and the Republican conference controls who holds it. Now, its published rules provide for the election of party officers in contested leadership elections use a secret written ballot. Trump can make a leadership challenge politically unavoidable, though. He can say Thune is not advancing the agenda. He can pressure enough Republican senators and publicly back another person. But Republican senators would have to make the change inside of their own conference. Now, the current number 2 Republican is Assistant Majority Leader John Barrasso. That would make Barrasso relevant if a vacancy or challenge develops, but he's not an automatic successor. The conference can elect another senator ultimately to replace both of them. So the protocol is not Trump announcing a replacement from the White House. Okay, it's Trump applying pressure, Republican senators deciding whether to reopen the leadership question, and the conference choosing the floor leader. That brings us to J.D. Vance, Vice President and President of the Senate. Vance can preside over the chamber, rule on certain points of order, and cast a vote when the Senate's tied. What he cannot do is seize Thune's job. The Majority Leader receives priority recognition and controls the floor schedule. So Vance can't simply call up save over Thune's objection, and he can't erase the 60-vote cloture threshold with his gavel. Vance becomes important if Senate Republicans try the nuclear option. That process begins with a senator raising a point of order about how to apply the cloture rule. The chair would make a ruling, or the question goes to the Senate. The senator can appeal the chair's ruling, and a simple majority can establish a new Senate precedent. Vance can be in the chair for that fight. If the decisive procedural vote is tied, he can break the tie. But there still has to be a Senate majority willing to make the change. Now, these distinctions matter, okay, because Vance is a force multiplier. He's not a substitute for a vote. His political role might be just as important, though. He can work with Trump, Thune, and the Republican conference to count votes before the fight begins. If the votes are there, he can be present for the procedural showdown. If they're not there, well, the administration will know exactly which Republican senators are refusing to move. So, folks, if you like what we're saying here, well, you probably don't, but if you like the investigative information, subscribe, because the next useful update is not another statement. It's the vote count, the floor date, or the name of the senators who are holding all of this up. So here's what can happen next. If Thune schedules save and files cloture, Democrats have to decide whether to block proof of citizenship and voter ID in public. If cloture fails, Republicans have to decide whether this bill is important enough to change the Senate precedent. Vance matters at that stage, but only if a majority is prepared to act. If Thune lets the Senate leave, Trump will call him back. Once the senators return, a continued refusal to schedule the bill becomes a leadership decision and not a calendar excuse. If Thune still refuses, Trump cannot fire him, but he can force Republican senators to decide whether they want to fire him or whether they want Thune managing the president's agenda. And while all of that happens, the Justice Department will continue the court appeal and decide whether to ask the Supreme Court for some emergency relief. Now, working Americans are tired of this delay. I know it. And the Senate is always going to be the route of this delay. President Trump has the ability to call them back from recess, so Thune will not get to hide behind the calendar. The real pressure point comes from knowing whether they come back and they're willing to get to work once they're back in that room. Trump can convene the Senate, Vance can preside over it and break a tie. But neither man, unfortunately, can supply the votes. That leaves Thune with a straightforward choice. Put Save America Act on the floor and show the country where every senator stands, or make Republican senators defend why they still want him as their leader. Now, I'd love for your take in the comments, folks. If the Senate leaves without acting on Save, would you suggest Trump call it back? And if Thune still refuses to move the bill, did Senate Republicans choose a new leader? The last Save update showed how the bill in August and the recess stall. And that's a little reflection point if you missed it. And it'll be coming up next.